Meine sehr geschätzten Damen und Herren,
Ladies and gentlemen, dear participants, let me wish you a very good morning. Welcome back to our conference here in Vienna. You know that we enjoy massive technical support for our conference, and we're still looking for the screen to work here behind me. I'm hoping that that'll work in a few minutes. Our conference is the fourth of its kind and of a series of conferences. And as you know, this year we have chosen the general topic of strategy and will. Now, yesterday, in the lectures we heard in the panel, we already talked about this, and we've heard a number of interesting ideas on the subject will and its influence on the political, strategic, and military domains, presented by Major General Militat and Ms. Manuela Krüger. The importance of the will to fight in military strategy. Are the Europeans up to it? That was the presentation given by Professor Dr. Janne Malari from Oslo. Then we had the panel discussion on economy, energy, and resources. And we had a mix of presentations and a discussion between Mr. König, Mr. Pöcher, Captain Lieutenant Gapsch, Mitra Arami, and Dominic Spanocchi. And Colonel Hollerer was the moderator of this discussion. Then we had a very interesting presentation by former Defense Minister Werner Fasselabend. He talked about great and superpowers, China and the United States. Two superpowers, to be more specific, and he explained quite well the concepts of outgoing and incoming superpowers. And then he also touched upon the great powers, Russia, European Union, and India. And then we closed the first day of our conference with a lecture by Eberhard Birk. Now, ladies and gentlemen, let us start with the second day of our conference. I was told that it's quite a tough schedule we have chosen for our conference. There were discussions until late at night yesterday, and now everyone's back at this early hour. So, well done, everyone. You seem to be quite in shape, and I'm delighted to see that you have joined us here in such great numbers at 8 o'clock in the morning, which is not surprising for the military, but it's a bit unusual for a conference. So thank you for being here, and let me now announce Brigadier Dr. PEISCHEL's speech. He's one of the organizers on our side of this conference. So, Brigadier, would you please come to the front? The floor is yours. And let me wish you all again a wonderful morning. We have beautiful weather outside.
Guten Morgen, meine Damen und Herren. Danke,
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Thomas, for introducing me. Let me welcome you to our second conference day too. And for the gentlemen at least, feel free to take off your jackets. As far as the ladies are concerned, it's not up to me to decide. Now, I was asked to limit the speed of my speech, and that's why they turned off the beamer. But that didn't quite work because we also have a television, and Mr. Meyer is going to help me changing the slides because it doesn't work from the podium. Now, the topic of our conference is to find the role of the factor strategy and will in war, which influence and it can have on various types of influences, how the importance of the phenomenon of will can have an importance on culture-specific developments. Now, some of the slides will discuss aspects which we've discussed in previous conferences. I don't intend to repeat anything. I just would like to touch upon these under new aspects. It's a continuation, not a repetition. I ask you to bear with me as regards the individual functions and principles I want to present. I cannot go into detail. It's rather a kaleidoscope which I would like to present with regard to strategy and strategy as a function of the will, and this should reflect the result of our 2 days of retreat which we had in Reichenau with our development team and the panel leaders in order to prepare the general orientation of the conference. Next slide. Now, it's part of the zeitgeist to start with a non-objective, to use that as a definition. Now, the definition of will you see on the screen is not our objective, and the picture you can see reminds us of what Bismarck said about our 2 states. He said that the barbarian is what you have when you turn an Austrian into a human, and that basically explains the understanding of the Prussian soldier of his world view and what he looks like as opposed to the rest of the world. But it's not the objective of our conference. It's about a starting point. The starting point for our conference's topic is that will is in a dialectical interaction with opposing also internal moments of will. That secondly, we need to find our own will and find our own strategic purposes, and that will, although not necessarily according to moral standards, still has to be legitimized in relation to subordinate values. The end justifies means to a certain extent. At least, however, it has to serve the survival of one's own society. So you can be reasonable in a general sense. Just remember what Dr. Koenig said about Ulysses and the subterfuges he used. So how much moral do you need in your will? Now, if will does not have reason, that's dangerous. Militat said it. And that's a core problem we have to face. Now let me start with early approaches to this understanding of leadership. You know this example of the chariot. Let me briefly touch upon it. Leading in German, führen, is linked to moving. And it shows that a leader moves or leads his people to a new future. In Germany, you have the alliteration of to lead and to follow, führen and follow. It's an old way of saying things, and you can see that there's an interplay between the leader and the led, which is quite typical for the German and continental cultural area. This leadership relation ends if the leader no longer leads. It's quite obvious, but it also ends if those who are led don't follow voluntarily anymore. So that's also a reason of democratic trust in armed forces, all those things we know from our leadership philosophy. It's the result of this leadership understanding, which cannot be translated into English because command in manum dare is something different. You have to use your hands to make people follow. You can pull them along if they don't want to follow. I don't want to be a moral leader myself here. It's just a different philosophical approach which we're talking about here. Now, a renewed discussion of this phenomenon seems necessary because the will of the leader, I lead and want you to follow me, is interacting with those that are led. I follow on out of my own free will. There's a reaction between leader and led, and there is an iterative evaluation of the performance and trustworthiness of the leader on the side of those who are led, because the need for mutual acceptance makes the aspect of interplay between the will, that's something which is particularly important. Thank you for having found these sources here. My colleague Mr. Leise found this passage in Landrecht 3 of the Sachsenspiegel. It's the codification of feudal law, and it always contains the fact that the leader or the feudal leader has right on the subjects, of course. So you also have aspects of subjects who can no longer follow the leader if the leader doesn't take on his responsibility. So we have this specificity of the German cultural area again, which we can also see in this source, the Sachsenspiegel. This virtue, however, then disappears in the 19th century because, according to the doctrine of the divine right, you can't have a leader who's not right, so it's a step back, actually. Of course, you always need to take our great ancestor Clausewitz into consideration. He's describing the strength of will, much strength of will, and you will remember the 4 dimensions of the concept of will I talked about, and he mainly focuses on enforcement of the will. In Extended Dual, he describes the physical violence used in the enforcement of will, but he also touches upon the dialectic interplay of opposite moments of will, and there are extraordinary or features as opposed to forces too. So this is the strategic and creative dimension of will, which also touches upon the broadness of strategic thinking. Will is not the effect on a dead mass. It's always an interplay of 2 living features, 2 independent moments of will that are placed to the fore. This intellectual dimension of the war is something that goes beyond Jomini in Clausewitz. One of his basic principles is the free activity of the soul, which is much stronger when it comes to the dimension of an interplay than to a iterative impact by one will on an opposing willing. So it's a question about how to break another's will. The focus of interplay of opposing will moments cannot be considered in an isolated way, because we're not acting on a piece of that matter which will react on an activity. And that's a difference between continental European and German-speaking German philosophies and others. So you have that matter on the one hand, and then an acting and reacting living force, which are opposed to each other. The first case allows for contingency planning. The second is based on an autonomous leadership philosophy, and you always have 3 opposing reactions to one combat idea, and so as of the second move in a combat, you will have a multitude of reaction options which can no longer be controlled. You can also read about this in Krefeld. who wrote about the problem of exaggerated planning staffs. So it was about people acting on the ground who had to get in contact with the planning staff, who, however, did not know the situation on the ground. And this maybe led Eisenhower to saying, "Plan is nothing, planning is everything." This is something that hints to the benefits of situational planning in the German system, which was avoiding exaggerated planning activities. Now, the clash of two independent wills increases the possibility of reaction. So scenario management, foresight management, outlooks on the future cannot work. So the bridge between contingency planning and an autonomous planning is described by Moltke the Elder. He very often introduced to saying you should plan up until the first clash with the opponent. As of that moment, you should only lead. Now, based on these basic considerations, you can draft the following hypotheses. Strategy is a way of expression, a form of expression, a function of the will. Will is a central constitutive element which distinguishes it of security, politics, conflict research, security studies, and the likes. There's no description of that which is happening, of dangers we have. It's more about defining what the actor, the player wants, how he understands it, and how he wants to implement it. And that's the USP of our conference here, as opposed to general strategy conferences. Now let me return to what Professor Holland-Matlery mentioned yesterday and even in earlier conferences. Strategy does not know a win-win situation. It's a zero-sum game. You lose, the other wins. And so strategy arises where a will is born to win a conflict against the resistance of opponents. So strategy without interests would be a strategy without purpose and therefore a contradiction in itself. The strategy development dimension of our conference actually touched on this phenomenon and tried to find a working definition which was based on finding a compromise when using resources. Of course, you can always conflict the situation too, and it would be difficult to find a win-win situation. However, this would allow for a conceptual demarcation between strategy and politics. Strategy now aims at implementing a will and interest which can only be satisfied if the opponent is crushed. Then the definition we found in 2016, which was based on avoiding conflict, would have to be extended in the sense that conflicts cannot be prevented, but there are physical and violent forms. This form of conflict by physical violence can be avoided by economic developments, technological, educational advantage, demographic developments, and so on. So there are ways and means to avoid violent conflict and replace it by a non-violent one. There is a conflict still because strategy means interest. Now, on the basis of this working hypothesis, we can derive the following research question. The fact that we put an exaggerated emphasis on the will, which leads to believe or to the belief that we can shape reality, is that something that is a specific phenomenon to the German-speaking area? This leads me to the question about cultural spaces and the question of luck. There's some evidence that in the German-speaking world, mens agetat molem, so the meaning of will has such a prominent meaning because it really depends on the resources you have. But this can lead to bad defeats. I would like to give you some examples for this. You can see Rommel in the Western campaign, more than 80 kilometers of advance on one day, not observing what the leadership told him. We have information on this, which unfortunately it has not been classified by Professor Etchman, who generally knew everything that happened. But we know from people who participated in this that they had a discussion on the evening, and the commander received information on the plan of attack by the leader, accepted it, but then the person in charge of resources said we only have fuel for another 20 kilometers, and then the commander said, don't waste our time, let's move on. And they then found fuel which was left by the French, but which was still no longer available. It's quite an interesting story. Still, I did not find any written proof of this, but it's an interesting story, and maybe let's think about who we find more positive in this story, the supply commander or the general commander. So it's in the nature of the courses I was teaching that you actually seem to be quite amused by the fact that the leading commander would prevail over the supply commander. But the campaign was successful, so that was what counted in the end, even though the commander risked everything, risked the life of his people, so which hints to the fact that this must have been a wrong decision. Again, this reminds us of the fact that luck, fortune, has a role, and we talked about this yesterday also with respect to Frederick the Great. The situation is even more exaggerated if we look at Hegel, the German philosopher. Hegel actually said it's all the worse for reality if we only trust luck. Now, I had the luck to be a participant of the strategy forum of the Economic University, the strategy manager in charge of the new strategy of Volkswagen for electronic mobility, presented on the strategy of his company. And he said strategy works if reality does not oppose or does not present any resistance to it anymore. Now, I don't think this is arrogant. It's something which is part of our philosophy. Now, Frederick the Great, he wrote various wills. Now, you could imagine that he wrote about whom to give his castles and so on. No, that's not what he did. They were rather operational plans, just in case he would die early. If I'm killed, that's what he says. And in this will, he tries to convey his will to combat also beyond his own death. He wants to continue leading even if he is dead. Now, Frederick the Great and fortune. Fortune is not luck in gambling, but it's the luck of brave. You can force luck by will, right? He also said, "Fortune est toujours pour les gros bataillons." So he acknowledges that those usually are luckier or have more fortune who have larger battalions. So we can force luck by convincing leadership. In German, interesting enough, we only have one word for luck. In other languages, we have many synonyms. It's a concept which only arrived in the German language at a late stage. It's really about the luck or about the definition of how much eta you have in leadership. So overall, this principle of eta, reducing eta, Mr. Koenig spoke about it yesterday, can be summarized in one single definition to just fill everything by one's own mind. You have three categories: intuition, luck, and art. So that's the gut feeling or trained intuition. Then we have luck in gambling, and in art we have expressive art, the various types of art, which lead you to artfulness in the sense of skillfulness. It's not about the will of a small defiant child. It's about a visionary form of thinking, about convincing, about creating allegiance for a strategic purpose that serves security and the survival of the state. Let me try to touch upon a few philosophical considerations. We heard about some of them yesterday. Philosophy knows the three parts of the psyche: will, knowledge, and feeling. Aristotle divided it into three parts: the animalic and the human part. Reason can lead some of it, and this is where the interface with will is. How can we use our intuition to develop it into reasonable strategy based on reasonable will? Platon talks of the chariot. Reason is the leader of the chariot, which leads the other parts of the soul. Non-will. Omission can also be the expression of will if the power of will is actually involved. Just think of quitting to smoke. That's something you want to do, but it's still something which you do not do. A parallel for something we have in Europe is related to the strategy we have developed quite some time ago, and which is based on the fact that we don't want to be involved in war ever again. It's not just a post-war motto. It has been raised to be a strategic purpose. But can this be this negative aim? Can it be a strategic purpose? It's just like saying, I don't want to drive faster than 130 kilometers an hour. That's the operative execution of a strategy. We need a more general objective. So being undecided not to want something is the opposite of will, which is aimed at securing survival. It does not have a strategic purpose. And if you believe that this is the kind of strategy you need to apply as regards China, the whole thing gets a bit critical and dangerous. There are various levels we have to define. Strategic purposes which have to be defined. China said we want to be world leader in the area of GDP production by the year 2049. The second level is operational implementation, which in China means do not get drawn into a war on the way to achieving this goal. This doesn't actually mean that China wants to avoid war. If China will be of the opinion that war can be useful, or if there's a war between other opponents, then China will probably use this conflict fought by others to its own benefit. It also doesn't mean that on an operative level China will not wage war or defend itself. It just means that actively or passively it will not be drawn into war. So, to the outside world and seen from a superficial point of view, you can say China does not want war, but it recognizes the possibility, the potential arrival of war. It will not be surprised if someone else starts a war and China needs to defend itself. And saying I don't want to have war ever again, it's a negation of this principle. So that's really the opposite of what the Chinese are doing. And the fact that both parties are not at war currently does not mean that these two approaches are the same.
This is a picture how I try to explain strategy. So the strategist is the javelin thrower who throws a javelin to the other side of the bank together with an arrow, and then he steps aside and hands over to the operative leader. So if it is true what German idealism or Hegel in particular claims that the spirit creates reality, then one must just imagine things one wants to achieve, to be able to think of. Now, why does the javelin thrower look further into the future than his subordinate leaders? Does he use his imagination to create goals that weren't there before? Does he create strategic purpose by making the enthusiasm, or by arousing enthusiasm in his subordinates? And here I come to visualization, which is a concept that I developed. So we know that by the power of our mind, we can sort of imagine something. And if we find a picture and a metaphor for something, we can draw it, for example. So things that you want to become a reality should first be able to be put down on paper, to draw it. And this visualization is maybe the approach of a strategic leader who looks farther ahead into the future, not because he sees things earlier than somebody else, but because things that don't even exist are created in his mind by the power of his mind, and thus generates a following among his subordinates until they are willing enough to support this in order to bring it out of the fog of imagination and make it a reality. Maybe this is an important aspect of strategic thinking. But of course, this strategic purpose may lead us to a new purpose that is created. Next slide. Through Kant, you can also approach the question, is peace the state of nature and the will the drive for war, or is it the other way around? Only with the cultural achievement of will can I move from an original warlike state to peace. That's the ideal typical interface to philosophy. And this question is also the basis of this misconception mentioned about that this never again war would be a strategic purpose with realistic power. According to Thomas Hobbes in De Cive, or in Leviathan, the bellum omnium contra omnes, so the war of everybody against everybody, is a state of nature. So we have to say that nature provides oxygen, water, and food to enable man to survive, but that man who remains inactive does not collect, hunt, or gather, or does not form a will to protect himself against the winter cold, the wild animals would be mercilessly destroyed by the same nature. So he already lives without the intervention of hostile human beings in such a bellum as sketched by Hobbes. Will and Kant. So the freedom that Kant means is the freedom of will as the decision where the individual wants to go and what it wants to do, not the freedom to be inactive. According to Kant, based on the categorical imperative, Freiherr von Rosen concludes that peace is the purpose, not war. Therefore, it must be the original state. And if peace is the purpose, then in a crisis, the warlike intervention could be the means. So this would be a new relationship of purpose and means. And thus, Hobbes can draw this allows Hobbes to draw conclusions about Kant. So war is the original state, peace the cultural achievement that can be achieved through an active value-based will. So strategy thus forms the bridge carried by the will from the original state of war to responsible freedom. There's one more point, even though I'm already beyond my time limit. I'd like to close with Nietzsche. Nietzsche speaks of a prehistoric, pre-moral time where deeds are evaluated according to their effect, their impact, and later evaluates deeds according to their will or intention. That's morality arose, but it is transformed by social conventions, religion, and ideology. So he demands a move back to this new immorality as a corrective for human perspective. Confer this with Germanic law: the deed kills the man and not the will. So if you cheat somebody and the weapon doesn't fire, then, well, no harm is done, so you're lucky. But under new law, of course, if the intention is there and he pulls the trigger, even if the gun doesn't fire, he's still guilty. So the will to power is the principle underlying human life and nature from which everything can be explained. Without the will to power, there would be no reason and no appreciation. Psychology and the canon of values of society. Well, today we would speak of the good human, or the do-gooder. So these moral prejudices, as he refers to them, should be revalued. So a demoralization of strategic interest, the will to power, which he proposes, which according to Kant doesn't have to be a value-free strategy. If the strategy is in a subordinate context to be assigned to the categoric imperative, so the end can still justify the means. And I have to conclude and quote Grillparzer: morality is a muzzle for the will. Logic is a riser belt for the mind. Thank you for your attention. Now, if we have time for questions, then go ahead. General, please. Congratulations on this wonderful compilation and analysis. However, there's one thing I would like to mention. You said that security policy is something else. What you have presented, and the soldiers, we have to say it, also has to be used at the political and strategic level. So it cannot be that we're building up something based on science, so something that's scientifically founded, and not translated to other spheres. So in preparing here, we have wondered how to communicate this to politicians. But this is incredibly difficult. And as long as there is no political process, maybe by just gleaning a little bit of history at a time, but that's that then. No, I think we also need to communicate this to politicians. That's the first comment. And the second comment is that what you have presented here, that's wonderful. You talked about the will, power, etc. But there's one thing we must never forget. We have the largest army, the Americans, that are still working based on a different model. So as Clausewitz said, there are principles of leadership, and we can relate this to politics. We can say that there are principles that can be implemented based on political art. But there's one will at the top, which is then executed. But the art of leadership at the various levels, the art of implementing all of that is much more restricted if you're structured according to Jovini. And that's something that we can derive from your work. So how do you get in touch with your allies and communicate this? But congratulations, you did a wonderful job. Thank you, General. Actually, I would have loved to get those questions if I had a choice. So one of the main reasons why I have developed this conference or conceived of it together with my colleague is that, of course, politics should be open for our way of thinking. I'm not going beyond the primacy of politics, but anyway, this serves to prepare the ground for decisions to be taken. And we know that since Clausewitz or after Clausewitz, all of the German and continental chiefs of staff just resorted to operative thinking. So we are engaged in operational thinking, not strategic thinking. And this conference is supposed to address the future officers, encourage them to strategic thinking. That's our part. And I think we don't even need to involve politics yet. If we can do this on a broad basis, and if we have a good interface to politicians by providing advice, I hope the politicians are going to listen to us and we can become involved in politics. That's the objective of the conference. Secondly, in terms of leadership philosophy, Chaumigny versus Clausewitz, I believe that if you want to say, well, if you have more brain, that will save bloodshed. So if you have numeric superiority, you have to come up with a different tactics. So use brain and your brawn. So that's well, whoever has the resources doesn't have to invest in education. And I'm not saying this with a raised index finger. If you have enough resources, you'd be well advised not to, make people decide on their own. Well, if you say 3 battalions, you get 5, then nothing can go wrong. So I believe it doesn't make sense if the leadership philosophy that works with sufficient resources is taken to task to think differently. It's not going to work. But we're not going to get any more resources, so we will have to use our brain-based approach, our intellectual approach, because we don't have numeric superiority. But of course, in the time of digital warfare, with computer-based systems, well, the implementation at intermediate level costs time. And if you can communicate more quickly, then that's because the intermediate levels don't assess the information anymore. So to get really expensive equipment and then lose time in the battlefield because of excessive communication demands, well, I think we need to use different order tactics. And what's interesting is that Clausewitz has taken over something from Chaumigny. And I had to learn French, unfortunately, for my studies, and the French teachers asked us, who of you already knows the French word? And they said all kinds of words, boulangerie and whatnot. And I thought that I knew a good word, and I said coup d'oeil. And then she said, wow, great word, coup d'oeil, and what do you think it means? I said it's intuition and gut feeling or whatever, experience. And they said, that's a wonderful explanation, but that's not what it means. And what does it mean? Well, it means coup d'oeil is, well, the batting of the lids, of the eyelids. Well, maybe that's a secondary, well, maybe that's a regional concept. No, she said, no, we have a teacher from Normandy, one from Paris, one from the Spanish border. None know this interpretation of the word. So I think Clausewitz spoke French as well as I did, and he misused the word. And then years later in a Norwegian library, I looked up the coup d'oeil again, and saw its fifth significance. Well, of course it means a batting of the eyelid, but the fourth significance was only in Swiss French. It means, well, to have a gut feeling, the instinct, eye measure. So maybe Clausewitz did speak good French, after all, so sense of proportion, a good visual, a sound judgment is also what it means, this coup d'oeil, sense of proportion. So I'm not going to keep you any further. Thank you very much for your attention.